Miss Eleanor Hartley had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility. As governess to the Ashford children in their grand London townhouse, she existed in the shadows of gilded corridors, her worth measured only by her pupils' progress. But on this particular autumn afternoon in 1817, as she passed the Duke of Ravensmoore's study and heard him mutilating a passage of Virgil's Aeneid, something inside her snapped. Before propriety could silence her, she corrected his Latin, publicly, precisely, and in front of 3 visiting diplomats. The room fell silent. The Duke's steel-grey eyes locked onto hers. And in that moment, Eleanor realized she had just committed social suicide. What she didn't know was that her correction would change everything, because the Duke had been searching for someone exactly like her, and the translation error was no accident at all. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Eleanor Hartley had long ago accepted that her life would be one of careful steps and measured words. At 23, she occupied that peculiar space reserved for educated women of modest birth, too refined for the servants' quarters, too poor for the drawing room. The Ashford residence on Grosvenor Square was her entire world, a magnificent prison of marble floors and soaring ceilings where she taught French verbs and watercolor techniques to 2 precocious girls who would one day marry into families that would never acknowledge their governess's existence. The autumn of 1817 had painted London in shades of amber and rust. Eleanor watched the season change from the schoolroom window. 3 floors above the fashionable street where carriages rattled past carrying people to lives she would never know. Her own life was predictable, safe, suffocating. Each morning began at 6, each evening ended at 9, and the hours between were filled with conjugations, piano scales, and the careful maintenance of invisible boundaries. Lady Ashford, her employer, was not unkind, merely indifferent. Eleanor was a necessity, like good silver or proper linens, noticed only when absent or inadequate. The household staff treated her with polite distance, neither servant nor family, belonging nowhere. She took her meals alone in the small governess's parlour, read by candlelight in her modest room, and reminded herself that independence, however lonely, was preferable to the alternative. That alternative had nearly claimed her 3 years ago. Eleanor's father, a country vicar of modest means, had died suddenly, leaving debts and a daughter with no prospects. Her mother's distant cousin, Mrs. Pemberton, had offered a solution. Marriage to her son, Thomas, a wine merchant twice Eleanor's age, with wandering hands and breath that reeked of his own product. The engagement had been announced before Eleanor fully understood what was happening. She remembered the weight of Thomas's hand on her waist, the way he looked at her, like merchandise he'd already purchased, the suffocating certainty that her life would become an endless series of obligations to a man she could never respect. She had fled to London with nothing but her education and a letter of reference from the local squire's wife. The Ashford position had been salvation, even if it meant surrendering any hope of a life beyond service. Eleanor told herself she was content. She had books, she had purpose, she had freedom from Thomas Pemberton's sweating palms and presumptuous smiles, but contentment, she was learning, was different from happiness. On this particular October afternoon, Eleanor descended from the schoolroom earlier than usual. The girls had been collected by their mother for a fitting at the Modiste, leaving Eleanor with a rare hour of freedom. She had intended to retrieve a book from the library, but as she passed the half-open door of Lord Ashford's study, she heard voices, and Latin. Quidquid id est, timeo Danaos et dona ferentes. A deep, cultured voice was saying, "Whatever it is, I fear the Greeks even when they bring gifts. Surely this passage supports our position regarding the French delegation's proposal." Eleanor paused. She shouldn't linger, shouldn't listen, but something in the speaker's tone, confident, authoritative, completely wrong, made her feet stop moving. "Your Grace makes an excellent point," Lord Ashford was saying with the obsequious enthusiasm he reserved for important guests. "The classical precedent is quite clear." "Indeed," another voice added, "the Duke of Ravensmoore's scholarship is well known. If His Grace sees parallels to our current diplomatic situation—" Eleanor's fingers tightened on her book. The translation was correct, but the application was entirely backward. The passage from the Aeneid wasn't about justified suspicion. It was about tragic misunderstanding, about fear that destroyed what it sought to protect. Using it to argue for diplomatic mistrust was to miss Virgil's entire point. She should walk away. She should absolutely, definitely walk away. Instead, she found herself stepping into the doorway. The study was thick with pipe smoke and masculine certainty. 4 men stood around Lord Ashford's desk, examining documents spread across the mahogany surface. 3 she didn't recognize, but the 4th, the one who had spoken, made her breath catch. The Duke of Ravensmoore was perhaps 30, tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes the color of winter storms. He wore his authority like a well-tailored coat, perfectly fitted and utterly natural. Everything about him spoke of power, the set of his shoulders, the casual way he dominated the space, the deference in every other man's posture. "Forgive me," Eleanor heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt, "but I believe you've misunderstood Virgil's intention." The room froze. 4 faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from shock to outrage. Lord Ashford's face went purple. "Miss Hartley," he sputtered. "What is the meaning of—" But the Duke raised one hand, silencing him, those grey eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made her want to flee and stand straighter all at once. "You disagree with my interpretation?" His voice was soft, dangerous, curious. Eleanor knew she should apologize, curtsy, disappear. Instead, she stepped further into the room. "The passage appears in Book 2 of the Aeneid," she said, meeting his gaze. "Laocoon speaks these words about the Trojan horse, warning his people not to accept the Greek gift. But Virgil's tragedy is that Laocoon was right, yet no one believed him. The gods themselves struck him down for his wisdom. The passage isn't a vindication of suspicion, Your Grace. It's a lament about truth ignored and wisdom punished. To use it as justification for diplomatic mistrust is to align yourself not with Laocoon's caution, but with the Trojans' fatal blindness." The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Ashford looked ready to expire from mortification. The other men stared at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. And the Duke smiled. It wasn't a kind smile or a warm one. It was the smile of a chess player who'd just seen an unexpected move on the board. "Fascinating," he said softly. "And where did a governess acquire such classical education?" The question was a blade wrapped in velvet. Eleanor felt the cut even as she answered. "My father was a scholar before he took orders, Your Grace. He believed education was wasted on no one, regardless of sex or station. How remarkably progressive of him." The Duke moved closer, and Eleanor fought the urge to retreat. "And do you make a habit of correcting your betters, Miss Hartley?" "I make a habit of correcting errors, Your Grace. The rank of the person making them is irrelevant to their inaccuracy." One of the other men gasped. Lord Ashford made a strangled sound. But the Duke's smile widened, showing teeth. "Is that so?" He was close enough now that she could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes, smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and something darker. "And if I told you that your correction, however accurate, was also impertinent, presumptuous, and grounds for immediate dismissal?" Eleanor's heart hammered, but she kept her chin up. "Then I would say truth is often impertinent, Your Grace, but remains truth nonetheless." For a long moment, the Duke simply looked at her, and Eleanor couldn't read his expression. Then he turned to Lord Ashford. "I require Miss Hartley's presence at Ravensmoore House tomorrow at 10 o'clock. I have a proposition for her. Your Grace, I assure you, she will be disciplined for this outrageous— Tomorrow, 10 o'clock. The Duke's voice cut through Lord Ashford's protests like a knife through butter. Then to Eleanor. "Don't be late, Miss Hartley. I despise unpunctuality almost as much as I despise inaccuracy." He swept from the room, the other men trailing in his wake, leaving Eleanor standing in the wreckage of her carefully constructed life, wondering what she had just done, and why part of her was thrilled rather than terrified. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the study over and over. By morning, she had convinced herself that the Duke's proposition would be a lecture on propriety, followed by a recommendation for her dismissal. Lord Ashford had certainly made his feelings clear. He'd sent word through the housekeeper that Eleanor was to consider herself on notice, her position hanging by a thread. She dressed with particular care in her best day dress, a modest grey wool that had seen better years but was clean and pressed. Her hands trembled as she pinned her dark blonde hair into a simple chignon. In the small mirror above her washstand, her reflection looked pale, her blue eyes too large in her face. The walk to Ravensmoore House in Mayfair took 20 minutes. Eleanor had passed the imposing mansion before. Everyone had. It was one of London's grandest residences, a palatial structure of white stone with columns that seemed designed to remind visitors of their insignificance. The Duke's family had held their title since the conquest, their wealth and influence woven into the fabric of English power for 8 centuries. And she, Eleanor Hartley, daughter of a country vicar, had corrected him in front of witnesses. The footman who answered her knock looked her up and down with barely concealed disdain before showing her not to a receiving room but to a large study lined with books. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held what must have been thousands of volumes. A massive desk dominated one end of the room, its surface covered with papers, maps, and correspondence in multiple languages. The Duke was reading when she entered, his dark head bent over a document. He didn't look up. "You're 3 minutes early, Miss Hartley. I'm uncertain whether to credit your eagerness or your anxiety." "Prudence, Your Grace. I allowed extra time in case of traffic." Now he looked up, and again she felt the impact of those grey eyes. "Sit." It wasn't an invitation. Eleanor sat in the chair across from his desk, back straight, hands folded, preparing herself for whatever was coming. "I've made inquiries about you," the Duke said, setting down his papers. "Eleanor Catherine Hartley, 23, daughter of the late Reverend James Hartley of Ashford-on-Thames, educated by your father to an unusual degree, Latin, Greek, French, Italian, mathematics, natural philosophy. Your father died 3 years ago, leaving debts. You fled an unwanted engagement to London and secured the Ashford position. You're considered competent but odd, too educated for comfort, too poor for respect. You have no family, no prospects, and no future beyond a succession of governess positions until you're too old to be employable. Does that summarize your situation accurately?" Each word was a stone added to the weight on Eleanor's chest. Hearing her life reduced to such stark terms made it sound even more hopeless than she'd realized. "Yes, Your Grace," she managed. "And yet yesterday you risked that precarious position to correct me about Virgil. Why?" Eleanor met his gaze. "Because you were wrong, Your Grace, and using that wrongness to influence diplomatic policy. My position seemed less important than accuracy." "How admirably principled." His tone made it sound like an insult. "Or how remarkably foolish. I haven't decided which." He stood, moving to the window, his back to her. "I have a problem, Miss Hartley. I am engaged in delicate negotiations with several foreign powers. These negotiations require precise translation and interpretation of classical texts, historical documents, and contemporary correspondence in multiple languages. My current secretary is adequate for English and French, but useless for anything requiring actual scholarship. I need someone with genuine linguistic skill and historical knowledge, someone who can catch errors before they become diplomatic incidents." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. "Your Grace, are you offering me a position?" He turned, and his expression was cold. "I'm offering you an opportunity to be useful. The position would require you to work here at Ravensmoore House 6 days a week. You would assist with translations, research and correspondence. You would attend certain diplomatic functions as part of my household staff to provide immediate linguistic support. The salary would be 3 times what Ashford pays you, with room and board included. It was more than Eleanor had dared hope for. More money, more intellectual engagement, escape from the Ashford household's stifling routine, and yet something in the Duke's manner made her cautious. "And the 7th day, Your Grace, is yours to do with as you please, provided you remain available for emergencies." He moved back to his desk, pulling out a document. "There are conditions. You would be part of my household, which means your conduct reflects on me. You will be discreet, obedient, and above reproach. You will not discuss my business with anyone outside this house. You will not presume on your position or imagine that intellectual utility grants you social equality. You will remember at all times that you are an employee, nothing more. Is that clear?" The words stung, but Eleanor had spent 3 years learning to swallow her pride. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." "Good. You'll start Monday. I'll send word to Ashford that I'm acquiring your services. You may collect your things tomorrow." He held out the document. A contract. "Read it carefully. If the terms are acceptable, sign it and leave it with my secretary on your way out." Eleanor took the papers with hands that had steadied. This was happening. This was actually happening. "Your Grace, may I ask why you're doing this? Surely there are male scholars who could—" "Male scholars come with egos, expectations, and social connections that complicate matters," the Duke interrupted. "You come with desperation, which makes you reliable, and obscurity, which makes you invisible. You're qualified, you're available, and you're sufficiently insignificant that no one will question your presence in my household. Those are the only reasons that matter." The casual cruelty of it took Eleanor's breath away. She was useful because she was desperate, employable because she was nobody. It was the truth, but hearing it stated so baldly felt like being flayed. "I understand, Your Grace. I doubt that, but you will." He returned to his papers, dismissing her without another word. "Close the door on your way out." Eleanor stood, clutching the contract, and walked from the room on legs that felt disconnected from her body. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, breathing carefully, trying to process what had just happened. She should feel grateful. She should feel relieved. Instead, she felt something closer to humiliation, the sharp, bitter knowledge that her worth was measured entirely by her usefulness, that she was valued precisely because she was valueless. But she would sign the contract. Of course she would, because the Duke was right about one thing. She was desperate, and desperation didn't have the luxury of wounded pride. She found the secretary's office, signed the contract with a hand that barely shook, and walked out of Ravensmoore House into the grey London morning. Behind her, watching from his study window, the Duke of Ravensmoore allowed himself a small smile. Phase 1 was complete. Miss Eleanor Hartley had no idea what she'd just agreed to, or why he'd really sought her out, but she would learn soon enough. The game, after all, was only beginning. Eleanor's final days at the Ashford residence passed in a blur of packing and pointed silences. Lady Ashford expressed no regret at her departure, only vague relief at avoiding the scandal of dismissal. The girls cried, which surprised Eleanor. She hadn't realized they'd grown fond of her. Their tears were the only genuine emotion anyone showed at her leaving. On Monday morning, a carriage bearing the Ravensmoore crest arrived to collect her and her modest trunk. The footman who'd answered the door on her first visit, she'd learned his name was Peters, helped load her belongings with marginally more respect than he'd shown before. Apparently, employment by the Duke elevated her status slightly, though his expression suggested the elevation was minimal. Ravensmoore House was even more intimidating from the inside. Eleanor was shown to a room on the 3rd floor, smaller than she'd expected, but infinitely finer than her governess's quarters at the Ashfords. It had a real bed with a thick mattress, a writing desk positioned near the window, and luxury of luxuries, a small bookshelf already filled with volumes in Latin, Greek and French. His Grace thought you might require reference materials, Peter said, noting her surprise. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, will explain the household routine. You're to present yourself in the Duke's study at 9 o'clock sharp. Rain. The household routine, Eleanor discovered, was vastly different from what she'd known. She wasn't quite a servant. She took meals in a small dining room reserved for upper staff, not the servants' hall. But she certainly wasn't family. She existed in that same liminal space she'd occupied before, but with one crucial difference. Here, her mind was valued even if her person wasn't. The Duke's study became her world. Each morning, she arrived to find stacks of correspondence, documents requiring translation, or historical texts needing interpretation. The Duke himself was often present, working at his desk while she worked at a smaller table by the window. He rarely spoke to her beyond terse instructions, but she felt his attention like a physical weight, as if he were constantly evaluating her usefulness. The work was challenging, intellectually demanding in ways that made her realize how starved she'd been for mental stimulation. She translated diplomatic correspondence from French and Italian, researched historical precedents for treaty negotiations, and corrected errors in documents prepared by the Duke's other secretaries. Occasionally, he would ask her opinion on a passage's interpretation, and she learned to answer directly, without false modesty or excessive deference. He had no patience for either. 3 weeks into her employment, everything changed. "You'll accompany me to Lady Thornbury's salon this evening," the Duke announced one afternoon, not looking up from his papers. Eleanor's pen paused mid-word. "Your Grace? Lady Thornbury hosts a weekly gathering for diplomatic and intellectual discussion. Several foreign ambassadors attend, along with scholars and politicians. I require your linguistic skills in case translation is needed. You'll be introduced as part of my household staff. I have nothing appropriate to wear to such an event, Your Grace." Now he looked up, one eyebrow raised. "Mrs. Blackwood has been instructed to provide suitable attire. You'll be ready at 7. The dress Mrs. Blackwood produced was simple but elegant, deep blue silk with minimal ornamentation, appropriate for someone of Eleanor's ambiguous status. It was finer than anything she'd ever worn, and when she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The Duke's carriage delivered them to a townhouse in Bloomsbury, blazing with light and humming with conversation. Eleanor's stomach churned with anxiety as they entered, but the Duke's hand appeared at her elbow, guiding her through the crowd with impersonal efficiency. Lady Thornbury's salon was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced. The drawing room was filled with people engaged in actual intellectual discourse, debating philosophy, discussing literature, arguing about politics. Women participated as equals, their opinions sought and respected. Eleanor found herself drawn into a conversation about Italian poetry, then another about French revolutionary philosophy, and discovered that here, finally, her education was an asset rather than an oddity. She was discussing Dante's political allegories with a visiting Italian scholar when she felt someone watching her. She turned to find the Duke observing from across the room, his expression unreadable. Later, as they prepared to leave, a man approached, tall, perhaps 35, with kind eyes and an easy smile. "Ravensmoore," he said warmly, "you must introduce me to your companion. I've been listening to her discussion of the Inferno's political subtext, and I'm thoroughly impressed." The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dr. Elias Reed, Miss Eleanor Hartley, my linguistic secretary. Miss Hartley, Dr. Reed is a physician and natural philosopher of some note." "Some note," Dr. Reed laughed. "Your Grace is too kind. Miss Hartley, I'm merely a country doctor who dabbles in scientific inquiry. But I am genuinely interested in your interpretation of Dante. Would you permit me to call on you to continue the conversation?" Eleanor glanced at the Duke, uncertain. His expression had gone cold. "Miss Hartley resides in my household, Reed. Any calls would need to be approved by me." "Of course." Dr. Reed's smile didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes, understanding perhaps, or sympathy. "Then perhaps we'll meet again at Lady Thornbury's." She's been kind enough to include me in her gatherings despite my lack of title or fortune. You're included for your mind, Dr. Reed, Eleanor found herself saying, which is rather the point of these salons, isn't it? Dr. Reed's smile widened. Indeed it is, Miss Hartley. Indeed it is. In the carriage ride home, the Duke was silent, staring out the window with an expression like carved ice. Eleanor sat across from him, confused by his mood and her own reaction to Dr. Reed's attention. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her as an intellectual equal, had seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than merely tolerating them. "You performed adequately this evening," the Duke said finally, his tone making adequately sound like an insult. "Thank you, Your Grace. Dr. Reed is a fortune hunter with more ambition than sense. You would do well to remember that any attention he pays you is motivated by proximity to me, not by genuine interest in your person." The words stung, but Eleanor kept her voice level. "I'm aware of my position, Your Grace. I have no illusions about my attractions." Good. But something in his tone suggested he wasn't pleased by her agreement. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and Eleanor stared out at the London streets, wondering why the Duke's warning bothered her so much, and why part of her hoped desperately that he was wrong about Dr. Reed's motivations. In his corner of the carriage, the Duke watched Eleanor's reflection in the window and felt something uncomfortably close to jealousy, which was absurd. She was an employee, a useful tool, nothing more. He repeated that to himself several times, but the tightness in his chest didn't ease. Over the following weeks, Eleanor's life transformed in ways she'd never imagined. Lady Thornbury's salon became a regular fixture. The Duke required her presence at each gathering, ostensibly for translation purposes, though Eleanor suspected other motives. She found herself part of a circle of intellectuals and reformers, people who valued ideas over titles, who treated her as a colleague rather than a curiosity. And there was Dr. Elias Reed. He appeared at every salon, and somehow always found his way to Eleanor's side. Their conversations ranged from natural philosophy to literature, from politics to poetry. He had a gift for making complex scientific concepts accessible, and he listened to her opinions with genuine interest. Unlike the Duke, who valued her mind but made clear it was her only valuable attribute, Dr. Reed seemed to appreciate her as a whole person. "You're wasted as a secretary," he told her one evening as they discussed medical advances. "You should be teaching, writing, contributing to scholarly discourse." "Should be and can be are different things, Dr. Reed," Eleanor replied, though his words warmed something cold inside her. "The world isn't structured to accommodate women with intellectual ambitions. Then perhaps the world's structure needs changing." His brown eyes were earnest. "There are people working toward that change, Miss Hartley. You could be part of it." Eleanor glanced across the room to where the Duke stood in conversation with a French diplomat, his posture rigid, his attention seemingly focused on his companion. But she'd learned to read his moods, and she knew he was aware of every word she and Dr. Reed exchanged. "I have employment, Dr. Reed. That's more than most women in my position can claim. I'm grateful for it." "Grateful." Dr. Reed's expression turned sad. "You deserve more than gratitude for scraps, Miss Hartley. You deserve recognition, respect, opportunity." Before Eleanor could respond, the Duke appeared at her elbow. "Miss Hartley, the ambassador requires translation assistance." His tone was clipped, his eyes cold as they flicked to Dr. Reed. "If you're quite finished with your social calls." It was a dismissal and a reprimand. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush as she excused herself, following the Duke across the room. But there was no ambassador requiring assistance. Instead, the Duke guided her to a quiet corner, his hand firm on her arm. "You're here to work, Miss Hartley, not to flirt with impoverished physicians." "I wasn't flirting, Your Grace. I was having a conversation." "A distinction, without a difference." His grey eyes were storm-dark. "Dr. Reed is a distraction you cannot afford. Your position in my household depends on your focus and discretion. Romantic entanglements would compromise both." I'm not seeking romantic entanglement, Your Grace. I'm simply enjoying intellectual discourse with someone who treats me as an equal. He treats you as a potential conquest. There's a difference." The Duke's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "You're an intelligent woman, Miss Hartley. Don't be foolish enough to mistake friendly attention for genuine regard. Men like Reed see women like you as opportunities, educated enough to be interesting, desperate enough to be available." The cruelty of it took Eleanor's breath away. "Is that how you see me, Your Grace? As desperate and available?" Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or regret, but his voice remained cold. "I see you as an employee whose usefulness depends on her judgment. Don't disappoint me." He walked away, leaving Eleanor trembling with anger and something more complicated. The Duke's words had been harsh, but they'd also revealed something. He cared about her interactions with Dr. Reed. Why? If she was merely a useful tool, why did it matter who she spoke with? The question haunted her through the rest of the evening and into the following days. The Duke's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was curt one moment, almost kind the next, demanding her presence constantly, yet barely speaking to her. Eleanor felt like a mouse being batted between a cat's paws, never certain when the claws would emerge. The situation came to a head at the Marchioness of Westfield's ball, a glittering affair Eleanor attended as part of the Duke's household staff. She stood near the wall, observing the spectacle of London society at play, when Dr. Reed appeared beside her. "Miss Hartley, you look like a prisoner watching freedom through bars." She smiled despite herself. "An apt metaphor, Dr. Reed. Then allow me to offer temporary parole. Dance with me?" Eleanor hesitated. She was staff, not a guest. Dancing would blur boundaries already dangerously unclear, but Dr. Reed's expression was so hopeful, and she was so tired of standing on the sidelines of life. "I shouldn't." "One dance, Miss Hartley. What harm could it do?" She took his hand. The waltz was a revelation. Dr. Reed was an excellent dancer, and for 3 minutes Eleanor forgot about her ambiguous position, her uncertain future, the Duke's cold warnings. She was simply a woman, dancing with a man who made her feel valued and seen. When the music ended, Dr. Reed didn't release her hand immediately. "Miss Hartley, Eleanor, if I may, I know your position is complicated. I know you're employed by Ravensmoore, dependent on his goodwill. But I want you to know that my interest in you has nothing to do with him and everything to do with you. Your mind, your spirit, your courage, you're extraordinary, and I would very much like the opportunity to know you better, if you'll permit it." Eleanor's heart hammered. "Dr. Reed, Reed!" The Duke's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He stood 3 feet away, his expression thunderous. "Your Grace," Dr. Reed said calmly, not releasing Eleanor's hand. "I was just returning Miss Hartley to your custody." "How considerate!" The Duke's tone could have frozen fire. "Miss Hartley, you're needed, immediately." It wasn't a request. Eleanor extracted her hand from Dr. Reed's, murmured an apology, and followed the Duke through the crowd. He led her not to any ambassador or diplomat, but to a private terrace, empty and cold under the November stars. "What?" the Duke said with deadly quiet. "Did I tell you about distractions? You told me not to be foolish, Your Grace. I don't believe dancing constitutes foolishness. You believe wrong." He moved closer, and Eleanor fought the urge to retreat. "Reed is playing a game you don't understand. He sees you as a route to my favor, my connections, my influence. The moment you cease to be useful in that regard, his interest will evaporate. You don't know that. I know men like him. I know how the world works, and I know that you, despite your intelligence, are remarkably naive about your own vulnerability. Then educate me, Your Grace." Eleanor's temper, usually so carefully controlled, finally snapped. "Explain to me why I shouldn't accept the attention of a kind, intelligent man who treats me with respect. Explain why I should remain grateful for employment that requires me to be invisible except when useful. Explain why my life should be limited to serving your needs while having none of my own acknowledged." The Duke stared at her, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she'd gone too far. Then, shockingly, he laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You want honesty, Miss Hartley? Very well. You shouldn't accept Reed's attention because you deserve better than a country physician with radical politics and no fortune. You shouldn't remain merely grateful because you're capable of far more than you realize. And your life shouldn't be limited to serving my needs because—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw clenching. "Because why, Your Grace?" The Duke looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his grey eyes. Then he stepped back, his expression closing like a door slamming shut. "Because I have other plans for you. You'll understand soon enough." He turned toward the door. "We're leaving. Collect your cloak." Eleanor stood on the terrace, shaking with adrenaline and confusion, watching the Duke's retreating back and wondering what he'd almost said, and why part of her desperately wanted to know. The week following the Westfield ball was torture. The Duke barely spoke to Eleanor beyond terse instructions, yet his presence seemed to fill every room she entered. She felt his attention constantly, a weight she couldn't shake or understand. "Dr. Reed sent flowers, modest but thoughtful, with a note requesting permission to call." The Duke denied the request without consulting Eleanor, which sparked an argument that left them both furious and unsettled. "You have no right to control my personal associations," Eleanor said, standing in his study with her hands clenched at her sides. "I have every right to protect my household from fortune hunters and radicals." The Duke didn't look up from his papers, which somehow made his words more insulting. "Dr. Reed is neither. He's a respectable physician with progressive views. He's a man with ambitions beyond his station and a convenient interest in my employee. Perhaps his interest is genuine. Perhaps not every man sees women as tools or transactions." Now the Duke looked up, his grey eyes blazing. "You think I see you as a tool? You've made that abundantly clear, Your Grace. I'm useful because I'm desperate, employable because I'm nobody, valuable only for my linguistic skills and my insignificance." The Duke stood abruptly, moving around his desk with predatory grace. "You're quoting my words back to me. They were memorable, Your Grace. Cruelty often is." He stopped inches from her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, smell sandalwood and something darker. "Those words were a test, Miss Hartley. One you passed admirably by, signing the contract despite them. But if you believe they represent my actual assessment of your worth, then you're not as intelligent as I thought." Eleanor's breath caught. "Then what do you think of me, Your Grace?" For a moment she thought he might answer honestly. His expression shifted, something raw and unguarded flickering across his features. Then the mask slammed back into place. "I think you're wasted on Reed, and I think you know it." He walked out, leaving Eleanor trembling with frustration and something dangerously close to hope. 2 days later, everything changed again. Eleanor was working in the study when the Duke entered with a woman she didn't recognize. Elderly, elegantly dressed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Hartley, this is Lady Pemberton, a distant connection of my family. Lady Pemberton, Miss Eleanor Hartley, my linguistic secretary." Lady Pemberton studied Eleanor with unnerving intensity. "So this is the young woman causing such a stir. Ravensmoore, you didn't mention she was beautiful." Eleanor flushed. The Duke's expression remained neutral. "Her appearance is irrelevant to her skills, Aunt." "Nothing is irrelevant, dear boy. You should know that by now." Lady Pemberton moved closer to Eleanor. "My nephew tells me you're fluent in 4 languages, educated in classical literature, and possess a mind sharp enough to correct a duke in front of diplomats." Yes, my lady." "Oh, good. I need someone exactly like you." Lady Pemberton settled into a chair as if she owned it. "I'm traveling to Italy in 3 weeks to establish a school for girls. A real school, teaching real subjects, not just watercolors and French. I need an administrator who can handle curriculum, languages, and the inevitable resistance from traditional fools. The position pays well, includes housing, and offers actual authority." "Interested?" Eleanor's mind reeled. My lady, I'm employed by His Grace. Temporarily. Lady Pemberton waved a dismissive hand. Ravensmoore doesn't need a linguistic secretary. He needs a wife, but that's another matter. What he's been doing is preparing you. Preparing me. Eleanor looked at the Duke, who was studying his desk with intense focus. Your Grace. Lady Pemberton laughed. Oh, he hasn't told you. Typical. My nephew has been training you, Miss Hartley, exposing you to intellectual society, building your confidence, demonstrating your capabilities to people who matter, including me. He wrote to me 6 weeks ago describing a brilliant young woman being wasted as a governess and asking if I had a position worthy of her talents. I came to London specifically to meet you. Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her feet. You... what? Now the Duke looked up, his expression carefully blank. You were stagnating, Miss Hartley. You needed opportunity, not charity. Lady Pemberton's school will provide both. But why? Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. Why would you do this? Because waste offends me. The Duke's tone was clipped, professional. You have abilities that shouldn't be squandered on governess work or secretarial duties. Lady Pemberton can offer you a future, independence, purpose, respect, everything you deserve. Everything except him. The thought came unbidden, and Eleanor pushed it away, but not before something of it must have shown on her face, because the Duke's expression tightened. This is an extraordinary opportunity, Lady Pemberton said, oblivious to the tension. Say yes, Miss Hartley. Come to Florence with me. Build something meaningful. Eleanor looked at the Duke, searching his face for what? Some sign that he wanted her to stay, some indication that his interest was more than professional, but his expression remained closed, unreadable. May I have time to consider, my lady? Of course, but not too much time. I leave in 3 weeks, and I need an answer within the fortnight. After Lady Pemberton departed, Eleanor and the Duke stood in silence. Finally, Eleanor spoke. You've been planning this, all of it. The salons, the introductions, even Dr. Reed. Reed was an unexpected complication, not part of any plan. But the rest? You've been preparing me to leave? The Duke moved to the window, his back to her. I've been preparing you to have choices, Miss Hartley. What you do with them is your decision, and if I choose to stay... The silence stretched so long, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Then, you'd be a fool to stay. Lady Pemberton is offering you everything I cannot. Freedom, equality, a future built on your own merits, rather than someone else's charity. Is that what this has been? Charity? No. The word came out harsh. It's been complicated. Eleanor moved closer, her heart pounding. Then uncomplicate it, Your Grace. Tell me plainly why you're sending me away. The Duke turned, and for the first time since she'd met him, his mask cracked completely. What she saw in his eyes made her breath stop, longing, frustration, something that looked almost like anguish. Because I'm a duke, Eleanor. Because you're a vicar's daughter with no fortune or connections. Because even if I were fool enough to offer you a position in my life beyond employment, society would destroy you for accepting it. Because you deserve a man who can give you respect and partnership, not scandal and limitations. Because... He stopped, his jaw clenching. Because Reed was right. You deserve more than gratitude for scraps. Eleanor's eyes burned. What if the scraps are what I want? Then you're not as intelligent as I believed. But his voice was gentle, almost tender. Go to Italy, Eleanor. Build Lady Pemberton's school. Create a life where your mind and your courage can flourish without constraint. Don't waste yourself on impossible situations and men who can offer you nothing but complications. And if I believe some complications are worth it? The Duke closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the mask was back in place. Then I would remind you that belief and reality are different things. You have 1 week to give Lady Pemberton your answer. I suggest you choose wisely. He walked out, leaving Eleanor alone in the study, tears streaming down her face, understanding finally what the Duke had been doing and why. He'd been setting her free, even though it was clearly breaking something inside him to do it. 6 months later, Florence blazed with summer heat and possibility. Eleanor stood in the courtyard of the Pemberton Academy for Young Women, watching her students, 20 girls ranging from 12 to 18, debate the merits of Machiavelli's political philosophy in surprisingly sophisticated Italian. The school had exceeded every expectation, attracting students from across Europe and earning grudging respect even from traditional educators who'd initially dismissed it as a radical experiment. Eleanor had found her calling. As head administrator and primary instructor of languages and classical studies, she'd helped build something genuinely revolutionary. A place where girls were taught to think, to question, to engage with ideas as intellectual equals. Lady Pemberton had proven a brilliant collaborator, and together they'd created an institution that was changing lives. Eleanor's own life had transformed as well. She had authority, respect, purpose. She'd published 2 scholarly articles on classical translation that had been well received in academic circles. She'd made friends among Florence's expatriate community and Italian intellectuals. She was independent, accomplished, content. She was also heartbroken, though she'd become adept at ignoring it. The Duke had written once, 3 months ago, a formal letter congratulating her on the Academy's success and wishing her well. It had been perfectly polite, utterly impersonal, and Eleanor had cried for an hour after reading it. She'd drafted 17 replies and sent none of them. What was there to say? Thank you for breaking my heart in the kindest possible way. She'd heard through Lady Pemberton that the Duke remained unmarried, focused on his diplomatic work, reportedly more cold and unapproachable than ever. Lady Pemberton had mentioned it casually, but Eleanor had seen the knowing look in the older woman's eyes. She knew. She'd probably known from the beginning. "Miss Hartley," one of her students, Sophia, came running across the courtyard. "There's a visitor asking for you, an English gentleman. He's waiting in Lady Pemberton's office." Eleanor's heart jumped, then settled. It wouldn't be him. Why would it be him? But when she entered the office, the Duke of Ravensmoore stood by the window, looking out at the Florentine hills, and Eleanor's carefully constructed contentment shattered like glass. He turned at her entrance, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. He looked thinner, she thought, with shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, but he was still imposingly handsome, still carried himself with that unconscious authority, still made her heart race with a single glance. "Your Grace." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "This is unexpected. I was in Rome for diplomatic meetings. Florence was on the way back to England. It was a lie. Florence was significantly out of the way, but Eleanor didn't challenge it. I wanted to see what you'd built. Lady Pemberton built it. I'm simply helping maintain it." "Liar!" But his tone was gentle. "I've read your articles, Eleanor. I've heard reports of the Academy's success. You've created something extraordinary." The use of her first name undid something inside her. "Why are you here, Your Grace?" The Duke moved closer, and Eleanor saw the tension in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his eyes, emotions she'd never seen him display before. "Because I've spent 6 months trying to convince myself I did the right thing, that sending you away was noble and selfless and in your best interest." He stopped an arm's length from her. "And I've failed completely. I can't convince myself of something that isn't true." Eleanor's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I was wrong, about what you deserve, about what's possible, about what matters." His grey eyes held hers with desperate intensity. "I'm saying that I've been miserable without you, that my study feels empty, that diplomatic functions are tedious, that nothing has felt right since you left. I'm saying that I don't care what society thinks, what complications arise, what rules we break. I'm saying—" He took a breath. "I'm saying that I love you, Eleanor. That I've loved you since you corrected my Latin and looked at me like I was a man, not a title. That I want you in my life, not as an employee or a charity case, but as my partner, my equal, my wife if you'll have me." Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "You're a duke. I'm a man who's been a fool." He reached for her hand and she let him take it. I'm a man who convinced himself that protecting you from scandal was more important than being honest about his feelings. I'm a man who spent 6 months realizing that a life without you isn't worth living, regardless of how proper or scandal-free it might be. Your Grace, Alexander. My name is Alexander. Use it. Alexander. The name felt strange and wonderful on her tongue. I have a life here, a purpose, everything you wanted for me. I know. And if you're happy, if this is truly what you want, I'll leave. I'll go back to England and I won't trouble you again. But if there's any part of you that wants what I'm offering, a complicated, probably scandalous, definitely unconventional life together, then I'm asking you to come home with me. Not as my employee or my charity case, but as my future Duchess, as my partner in every sense of the word. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the cold, controlled Duke, but a man who'd travelled across Europe to lay his heart at her feet. A man who'd spent 6 months being as miserable as she'd been. A man who was offering her not just love, but genuine partnership. What about the academy, she asked. I can't just abandon it. Then don't. We'll split our time between England and Florence. We'll support the academy financially and personally. We'll make it work because that's what partners do. They find solutions, not excuses. He squeezed her hand. I'm not asking you to give up what you've built, Eleanor. I'm asking you to let me be part of it. To let me be part of your life, the way you've been part of mine, since the moment you walked into that study and told me I was wrong about Virgil. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. I was right about Virgil. You were right about everything. Alexander pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face. Say yes, Eleanor. Choose the complication. Choose me. Oh. And Eleanor, who'd spent her whole life being practical and cautious and grateful for scraps, made the most impractical, incautious, greedy decision of her life. Yes. Alexander kissed her then, and it was nothing like Eleanor had imagined. It was better. It was promise and passion and partnership all at once. It was coming home to a place she hadn't known existed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. I have a confession, he murmured. The Latin translation, I knew it was wrong. I said it deliberately, loudly, hoping you'd correct me. I'd heard about the brilliant governess at the Ashford household, and I needed an excuse to meet you. The whole thing was a setup. Eleanor pulled back, staring at him. You... what? I was looking for a linguistics secretary. I'd heard you were qualified but trapped in a dead-end position. So I created a situation where you'd reveal your abilities and I'd have an excuse to offer you employment. I didn't expect... He smiled, and it transformed his face. I didn't expect you, the real you. I didn't expect to fall in love. Eleanor laughed through her tears. You manipulative, arrogant, wonderful man. Is that a yes to marriage? Or are you still deciding? It's a yes to everything. To marriage, to partnership, to building a life together, to complications and scandals and unconventional arrangements, to all of it. Good. Alexander kissed her again, softer this time, because I'm not letting you go again. Ever. Outside the window, Florence glowed golden in the afternoon sun. Inside, Eleanor Hartley, soon-to-be Eleanor Duchess of Ravensmoore, held the man she loved and marvelled at how a single moment of courage, one correction of a Latin translation, had led her here. To freedom, to love, to a future she'd never dared imagine. She'd bloomed where she was planted, yes, but now she was choosing new soil, new possibilities, new growth, and she couldn't wait to see what flourished next. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what resonated with you most about Eleanor and Alexander's journey. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may you always have the courage to correct the world when it's wrong, and to accept love when it finds you, even in the most unexpected ways.